Chapter 82. You listen here, gal. Don't you never let me hear about you fanning yo' tail round at Noah no mo'. I'd take a hickory stick to you in a minute. Headed home, Kunta stopped in his tracks 2 or 3 steps from the door of the cabin and stood listening as Belle went on. Why, you ain't even turned 16 yet. What yo' pappy think, you carrying on like that? He quietly turned and went back down along the path to the privacy of the barn, to consider the implications of what he had heard. Fanning her tail, around Noah. Belle personally hadn't seen whatever it was, but someone had told her. No doubt it had been Aunt Suki or Sister Mandy. Knowing those old biddies, it wouldn't surprise him if either or both of them had witnessed something completely innocent and made it sound suggestive, just to have something to cluck about. But what? From what he'd overheard, Belle probably wouldn't tell him unless it was repeated, and she needed him to put a stop to it. It was a kind of thing he'd never dream of querying Belle about, for that was too much like women's gossip. But what if it hadn't been so innocent? Had Kizzy been flaunting herself before Noah? And if she had, what had he done to encourage it? He had seemed to be a young man of honor, of good character, but you never knew. Kunta wasn't sure how to feel or what to think. In any case, as Belle had said, their daughter was only 15, which in the customs of the Tubob's land was still too young for her to be thinking about getting married. He realized that he wasn't feeling very African about it, but somehow he just didn't feel ready to think about Kizzy walking around with a big belly as he'd seen on so many girls her age, even younger. If she did marry Noah, though, he thought, at least their child would be black, and not one of those pale Sassoboro babies, products of the mothers having been raped by lusting massas or overseers. Kunta thanked Allah that neither his Kizzy nor any other Slavero women ever had faced that horrifying experience, or at least not since he had been there. For countless times he had heard Massa Waller strongly expressing among friends his convictions against white and black bloods being mixed. The next few weeks, as the opportunity would present, Kunta covertly watched Kizzy's bottom for any signs of wiggling. He never caught her at it, but once or twice both he and she were startled when he came upon her in the cabin, twirling round and round, tossing her head and humming dreamily to herself. Kunta also kept a close eye on Noah. He noticed that now, unlike before, Noah and Kizzy would nod and smile whenever they passed each other within the sight of anyone else. The more he mused on it, the more strongly he speculated that they were skillfully concealing their ardor. After a while, Kunta decided that there should be no harm in Noah and Kizzy's publicly taking conversational walks together, in his accompanying her to camp meeting, or to the dance old Jenny Down frolics that were held each summer, where Noah as her partner would surely be preferable to some impudent stranger. Indeed, it was possible that, after another reign or so for them both, Noah might even make Kizzy a good mate. An awareness began to dawn within Kunta that Noah had begun to observe him just as closely as the other way around, and now Kunta anticipated, nervously, that the boy was trying to muster the nerve to ask if he could marry Kizzy. It was on a Sunday afternoon in early April. Massa Waller had brought a family of guests home with him after church, and Kunta was outside the barn polishing the guest's buggy, when something told him to glance up, and he saw a dark, slender Noah walking purposefully down along the path from Slave Row. Reaching Kunta, he spoke without hesitation, as if his words were rehearsed. "Ol' sah, you's the only'st one I feels like I can trust. I got to tell somebody. I can't live no mo' like this. I gotta run away." Kunta was so astounded that at first he could think of nothing to say. He just stood there, staring at Noah. Kunta finally found some words. "You ain't gon' run nowhere wid Kizzy." It wasn't a question, but a statement. "Nah, sah, wouldn't want to get her in no trouble." Kunta felt embarrassed. After a while he said non-committally, Reckon sometime everybody feel like runnin'." Noah's eyes inspected his. "Kizzy told me Miss Bell say you run off 4 times. Kunta nodded, his face still showing nothing of how he was thinking back on himself at the same age. Freshly arrived, so desperately obsessed with run, 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 that every day spent waiting and watching for the next even half-decent opportunity was an unbearable torment. A swift realization thrust itself into his head that if Kizzy didn't know, as Noah's earlier statement could be interpreted she didn't, then whenever her loved one suddenly disappeared, she was sure to be utterly devastated. So soon again after her crushing heartbreak involving the 2-bob girl, he thought that it just couldn't be helped. He thought that, for numerous reasons, whatever he said to Noah must be considered carefully. He said gravely, "Ain't going to tell you run or don't run. But lessen you ready to die if you gets caught. You ain't ready." "Ain't planning to get caught," said Noah. "I's hear de main thing is you follows de North Star, and it's different Quaker white folks and free helps you hide in de daytimes. Den you's free once you hits dat Ohio." How little he knows, thought Kunta. How could escaping seem anywhere near so simple? But then he realized that Noah was young, as he had been. Also that, like most slaves, Noah had seldom set foot beyond the boundaries of his plantation. This was why most of those who ran, field hands especially, were usually captured so soon, bleeding from briar cuts, half-starved and stumbling around in forests and swamps, full of water moccasins and rattlesnakes. In a rush, Kunta remembered the running, the dogs, the guns, the whips, the axe. "You don't know what you talking about, boy," he rasped, regretting his words almost as they were uttered. "What I mean to say, it just ain't that easy. You know about them bloodhounds they uses to cotch you?" Noah's right hand slid into his pocket and withdrew a knife. He flicked it open. The blade honed until it gleamed dully. "I figures dead dogs don't eat nobody. Cato had said that Noah feared nothing. Just can't let nothing stop me," Noah said, closing the knife and returning it into his pocket. "Well, if you're gonna run, you're gonna run," said Kunta. "Don't know exactly when," said Noah. "Just knows I gotta go." Kunta re-emphasized awkwardly. "Just make sure Kizzy ain't in none of this." Noah didn't seem offended. His eyes met Kunta's squarely. "Nah, sir," he hesitated. "But when I gets north, I means to work and buy her free." He paused. "You ain't going to tell her none of this, is you?" Now Kunta hesitated. Then he said, "Dat 'tween you and her." "I tell her in good time," said Noah. Impulsively, Kunta grasped the young man's hand between both of his own. "I hopes you makes it." "Well, I see you," said Noah, and he turned to walk back toward Slave Row. Sitting that night in the cabin's front room, staring into the low flames of the hickory log burning in the fireplace, Kunta wore a faraway expression that made both Belle and Kizzy know out of past experiences that it would be futile to make any effort to talk with him. Quietly Belle knitted. Kizzy was as usual hunched over the table practicing her writing. At sunup, Kunta decided he would ask Allah to grant Noah good luck. He thought afresh that if Noah did get away, it would yet again crush utterly Kizzy's trusting faith that already had been wounded so badly by Missy Ann. He glanced up and watched his precious Kizzy's face as her lips moved silently, following her finger across a page. The lives of all black people in the 2-bob land seemed full of suffering, but he wished he could spare her some of it. Chapter 83. It was a week after Kizzy's 16th birthday, the early morning of the first Monday of October, when the Slave Row field hands were gathering as usual to leave for their day's work, when someone asked curiously, "Where Noah at?" Kunta, who happened to be standing nearby talking to Cato, knew immediately that he was gone. He saw heads glancing around, Kizzy's among them, straining to maintain a mask of casual surprise. Their eyes met. She had to look away. "Thought he was out here early with you," said Noah's mother, Ada, to Cato. "Nah, I was aiming to give him the devil for sleeping late," said Cato. Cato went banging his fist at the closed door of the cabin, once occupied by the old gardener, but which Noah had inherited recently on his 18th birthday. Jerking the door open, Cato charged inside, shouting angrily, "Noah!" He came out looking worried. "And like him," he said quietly. Then he ordered everyone to go quickly and search their cabins, the toilet, the storerooms, the fields. All the others ran off in all directions. Kunta volunteered to search the barn. "Noah! Noah!" he called loudly for the benefit of any who might hear, although he knew there was no need of it, as the animals in their stalls stopped chewing their morning hay to look at him oddly. Then, peering from the door and seeing no one coming that way, Kunta hastened back inside to climb quickly to the hayloft, where he prostrated himself and made his second appeal to Allah for Noah's successful escape. Cato worriedly dispatched the rest of the field hands off to their work, telling them that he and the fiddler would join them shortly. The fiddler had wisely volunteered to help with the field work ever since his income from playing for dances had fallen off. "Believe he done run," the fiddler muttered to Kunta as they stood in the backyard. As Kunta grunted, Belle said, "He ain't never been missin', and he don't slip off nights." Then Cato said what was uppermost in all of their minds. "Gonna have to tell Massa, Lord have mercy." After a hurried consultation, Belle recommended that Massa Waller not be told until after he had eaten his breakfast, 'cause the boy done just eased off somewhere and got scared to slip back 'fo it's dark again, lessen them road patrollers cotches him. Belle served the Massa his favorite breakfast, canned peaches in heavy cream, hickory smoked fried ham, scrambled eggs, grits, heated apple butter, and buttermilk biscuits, and waited for him to ask for his second cup of coffee before speaking. "Massa," she swallowed, "Massa, Cato asked me to tell you look like that boy Noah ain't here this mawnin'." The Massa set down his cup frowning. "Where is he then? Are you trying to tell me he's off drunk or tomcatting somewhere and you think he'll slip back today? Or are you saying you think he's trying to run?" "All a sayin', Massa," Belle quavered. "It seem like he ain't here, and us done searched everywheres." Massa Waller studied his coffee cup. "I'll give him until tonight. No, tomorrow morning, before I take action. Massa, he a good boy, born and bred right here on yo' place, and work good all his life. Ain't never give you or nobody a minute's trouble." He looked levelly at Belle. "If he's trying to run, he'll be sorry." "Yes'm, Massa." Belle fled to the yard, where she told the others what the Massa had said. But no sooner had Cato and the fiddler hurried off toward the fields than Massa Waller called Belle back and ordered the buggy. All day long, as he drove him from one patient to the next, Kunta soared from exhilaration as he thought of Noah running, to anguish as he thought of the thorns and the briars and the dogs, and he felt what hope and suffering Kizzy must be enduring. All that night's huddled gathering, everyone spoke barely above whispers. "That boy done left here, for now I done seed it in his eyes," Aunt Suki said. "Well, I knows he ain't no youngin' to just steal off gettin' drunk, no sir," said Sister Mandy. Noah's mother Ada was hoarse from a day of weeping. "My baby sho ain't never talked to me nothin' 'bout no runnin'. Lord, y'all reckon Massa gonna sell him?" No one chose to reply. When they returned to their cabin, Kizzy burst into tears the moment she got inside. Kunta felt helpless and tongue-tied, but without a word, Belle went over to the table, put her arms around her sobbing daughter, and pulled her head against her stomach. Tuesday morning came, still with no sign of Noah, and Massa Waller ordered Kunta to drive him to the county seat, where he went directly to the Spotsylvania jailhouse. After about half an hour, he came out with the sheriff, ordering Kunta brusquely to tie the sheriff's horse behind the buggy and then to drive them home. "We'll be dropping the sheriff off at the creek road," said the Massa. "So many runnin' these days. Can't hardly keep track. They'd rather take their chances in the woods than get sold down south. The sheriff was talking from when the buggy started rolling. "Since I've had a plantation," said Massa Waller, "I've never sold one of mine unless my rules were broken, and they know that well. But it's mighty rare." "Appreciate good masters, Doctor, you know that," said the sheriff. "You say this boy around 18? Well, I'd guess if he's like most field hands his age, there's fair odds he's trying to make it north." Quinta stiffened. "If he was a house—" "They're generally slicker, faster talkers. They like to try passing themselves off as free, or tell the road patrollers they're on their master's errands and lost their traveling passes, trying to make it to Richmond or some other big city where they can easier hide among so many and maybe find jobs." The sheriff paused. "Besides his mammy on your place, this boy of yours got any other kin livin' anywheres he might be trying to get to?" "None that I know of." "Well, would you happen to know if he's got some gal somewhere? Because these young bucks get their sap risin', they'll leave your mule in that field and take off." "Not to my knowledge," said the massa, "but there's a gal on my place, my cook's young'un. She's still fairly young, 15 or 16, if I guess correctly. I don't know if they've been haystacking or not." Quinta nearly quit breathing. "I've known him to have—" "At the age of 12, the sheriff chortled. "Plenty of these young wenches even draw white men, and boys'll do anything." Through churning outrage, Quinta heard Massa Waller's abrupt chilliness. "I have the least possible personal contact with my slaves, and to neither know nor concern myself regarding their personal affairs." Yes, of course," said the sheriff quickly. But then the massa's tone eased. "Along your line of thinking, though, this boy could have slipped off to see some other plantation gal. I don't know, and of course the others wouldn't say if they did. In fact, anything might have happened, some fight perhaps. He could be half dead somewhere. It's even possible that some of these slave-stealing poor whites could have grabbed him. That's been going on around here, as you know. Even some of the more unscrupulous traders engage in it. Again, I don't know, but I'm told this is the boy's first time being unaccounted for. His general manner now more careful. The sheriff said, 'You told me he was born on your place and never traveled much?' I'd guess he wouldn't have any idea how to even get to Richmond, let alone north," said the massa. "Exchange a lot of information, though," the sheriff said. "We've picked up some and beat it out of them, that they practically had maps on their heads of where they'd been told to run and where to hide. A lot of this can be traced to loving white people like the Quakers and Methodists. But since he ain't never been nowhere, ain't never tried running before, and ain't never give you no other trouble to now, sounds like to me a good bet a couple more nights in the woods might bring him back, scared to death and half starved. Powerfully moved by a hungry belly. And that'll save you spending to advertise in the Gazette or hiring some of these catchers with their dogs to track him. He just don't sound to my experience like one of them hard outlaw that's slipping around in and out of the swamps and woods right now, killing people's cattle and hogs like they would rabbits." "I hope you're right," said Massa Waller, "but whatever the case, he's broken my rules by leaving without permission to begin with, so I'll be selling him south immediately." Quinta's fists squeezed the reins so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. "Then that's a good $1,200 to $1,500 you've got running around loose somewhere," said the sheriff. "You've written me his description. I'll sure get it to the county road patrollers, and if we pick him up, or we hear anything, I'll let you know right away." Saturday morning after breakfast, Quinta was curry-combing a horse outside the barn when he thought he heard Cato's whip-poor-will whistle. Cocking his head, he heard it again. He tied the horse quickly to a nearby post and crept rapidly up the path to the cabin. From its front window he could see almost from where the main road intersected with the big house driveway. Inside the big house, he knew that Cato's call had also alerted Belle and Kizzy. Then he saw the wagon rolling down the driveway, and with surging alarm recognized the sheriff at the reins. Merciful Allah! Had Noah been caught? As he watched the sheriff dismount, Quinta's long-trained instincts tugged at him to hasten out and provide the visitor's winded horse with water and a rub-down, but it was as if he were paralyzed where he stood, staring from the cabin window, as the sheriff hurried up the big house front steps, 2 at a time. Only a few minutes passed before Quinta saw Belle almost stumbling out the back door. She started running, and Quinta was seized with a horrible premonition the instant before she nearly snatched their cabin door off its hinges. Her face was twisted, tear-streaked. "Sheriff and Massa talking to Kizzy," she squealed. The words numbed him. For a moment he just stared disbelievingly at her, but then violently seizing and shaking her, he demanded, "What'd he want?" Her voice rising, choking, breaking, she managed to tell him that the sheriff was scarcely in the house before the Massa had yelled for Kizzy to come from tidying his room upstairs. "When I heard him holler at her from the kitchen, I flew to get into drawing room hallway where I always listens from, but I couldn't make out nothing clear except he was mighty mad." Belle gasped and swallowed. "Den heard Massa ringing my bell, and I run back to look like I was comin' from the cookhouse, but Massa was a-waitin' in the doorway, with his hand holdin' the knob behind him. Ain't never seed him look like he did at me. He told me cold as ice to get out in the house, and stay out till I'm sent for." Belle moved to the small window, staring at the big house, unable to believe that what she had just said had really happened. "Lord God, what in the world sheriff want with my child?" she asked incredulously. Quinta's mind was clawing desperately for something to do. Could he rush out to the fields, at least to alert those who were chopping there? But his instincts said that anything could happen with him gone. As Belle went through the curtains into their bedroom, beseeching Jesus at the top of her lungs, he could barely restrain himself from raging in and yelling that she must see now what he had been trying to tell her for nearly 40 reigns about being so gullible, deluded, and deceived about the goodness of the Massa or any other two-bob. "Going back there!" cried Belle suddenly. She came charging through the curtain and out the door. Quinta watched as she disappeared inside the kitchen. What was she going to do? He ran out after her and peered in through the screen door. The kitchen was empty and the inside door was swinging shut. He went inside, silencing the screen door as it closed, and tiptoed across the kitchen. Standing there with one hand on the door, the other clenched, he strained his ears for the slightest sound, but all he could hear was his own labored breathing. Then he heard, "Massa?" Belle had called softly. There was no answer. "Massa?" she called again, louder, sharply. He heard the drawing-room door open. "Where's my Kizzy, Massa?" "She's in my safekeeping," he said stonily. "We're not having another one running off." "I just don't understand you, Massa." Belle spoke so softly that Quinta could hardly hear her. "The child ain't been out in yo' yard, hardly." The Massa started to say something, then stopped. "It's possible you really don't know what she's done," he said. "The boy Noah has been captured, but not before severely knifing the 2 road patrolmen who challenged a false traveling pass he was carrying. After being subdued by force, he finally confessed that the pass had been written not by me, but by your daughter. She has admitted it to the sheriff." There was silence for a long, agonizing moment. Then Quinta heard a scream and running footsteps. As he whipped open the door, Belle came bolting past him, shoving him aside with the force of a man, and out the back door. The hall was empty, the drawing-room door shut. He ran out after her, catching up with her at the cabin door. "Massa go and sell Kizzy. I knows it." Belle started screaming, and inside him something snapped. "Go and get her," he choked out, creeping back toward the big house and into the kitchen as fast as he could go, with Belle not far behind. Wild with fury, he snatched open the inside door and went changing down the unspeakably forbidden hallway. The Massa and the sheriff spun with disbelieving faces as the drawing-room door came jerking open. Quinta halted there abruptly, his eyes burning with murder. Belle screamed from behind him, "Where our baby at? We come to get her." Quinta saw the sheriff's right hand sliding toward his holstered gun as the Massa seethed, "Get out!" "You can't hear?" The sheriff's hand was withdrawing the pistol, and Kunta was tense to plunge for it, just as Belle's voice trembled behind him. "Yassa!" and he felt her desperately pulling his arm. Then his feet were moving backward through the doorway, and suddenly the door was slammed behind them, a key clicking sharply in the lock. As Kunta crouched with his wife in the hall, drowning in his shame, they heard some tense, muted conversation between the massa and the sheriff. Then the sound of feet moving, scuffling faintly, then Kizzy's crying, and the sound of the front door slamming shut. "Kizzy! Kizzy, child! Lord God, don't let him sell my Kizzy!" As she burst out the back door with Kunta behind her, Belle's screams reached away out to where the field hands were, who came racing. Cato arrived in time to see Belle screeching insanely, springing up and down with Kunta bear-hugging her to the ground. Massa Waller was descending the front steps ahead of the sheriff, who was hauling Kizzy after him, weeping and jerking herself backward, at the end of a chain. "Mammy! Mammy!" Kizzy screamed. Belle and Kunta leaped up from the ground and went raging around the side of the house like two charging lions. The sheriff drew his gun and pointed it straight at Belle. She stopped in her tracks. She stared at Kizzy. Belle tore the question from her throat. "You done this thing they says?" They all watched Kizzy's agony as her reddened, weeping eyes gave her answer in a muted way, darting imploringly from Belle and Kunta to the sheriff and the massa, but she said nothing. "Oh, my Lord God," Belle shrieked. "Massa, please have mercy. She ain't meant to do it. She ain't knowed what she was doin'. Missy Ann the one teached her to write." Massa Waller spoke glacially. "The law is the law. She's broken my rules. She's committed a felony. She may have aided in a murder. I'm told one of those white men may die." "Ain't her cut de man, massa. Massa, she worked for you ever since she big enough to carry your slop jar, and I done cooked and waited on you hand and foot over 40 years, and he," gesturing at Kunta, she stuttered, "he done drive you everywhere. You been for near 'bout that long. Massa, don't all that count for sompin'?" Massa Waller would not look directly at her. "You were doing your jobs. She's going to be sold. That's all there is to it." "Just cheap, low-class white folks splits up families," shouted Belle. "You ain't dat kind." Angrily, Massa Waller gestured to the sheriff, who began to wrench Kizzy roughly toward the wagon. Belle blocked their path. "Then sell me and her pappy wid her. Don't split us up." "Get out of the way," barked the sheriff, roughly shoving her aside. Bellowing, Kunta sprang forward like a leopard, pummeling the sheriff to the ground with his fists. "Save me, Fa!" Kizzy screamed. He grabbed her around the waist and began pulling frantically at her chain. When the sheriff's pistol butt crashed above his ear, Kunta's head seemed to explode as he crumpled to his knees. Belle lunged toward the sheriff, but his outflung arm threw her off balance, falling heavily as she dumped Kizzy into the back of his wagon and snapped a lock on her chain. Leaping nimbly onto the seat, the sheriff lashed the horse, whose forward jerk sent the wagon lurching as Kunta clambered up. Dazed, head pounding, ignoring the pistol, he went scrambling after the wagon as it gathered speed. "Missy Ann! Missy Ann!" Kizzy was screeching it at the top of her voice. "Missy Ann!" Again and again the screams came. They seemed to hang in the air behind the wagon swiftly rolling toward the main road. When Kunta began stumbling, gasping for breath, the wagon was a half-mile away. When he halted, for a long time he stood looking after it until the dust had settled, and the road stretched empty as far as he could see. The massa turned and walked very quickly with his head down back into the house, past Belle huddled sobbing by the bottom step. As if Kunta were sleepwalking, he came creeping slowly back up the driveway, when an African remembrance flashed into his mind, and near the front of the house he bent down and started peering around, determining the clearest prints that Kizzy's bare feet had left in the dust. Scooping up the double handful containing those footprints, he went rushing toward the cabin. The ancient forefathers said that precious dust kept in some safe place would ensure Kizzy's return to where she made the footprints. He burst through the cabin's open door, his eyes sweeping the room and falling upon his gourd on a shelf containing his pebbles. Springing over there, in the instant before opening his cupped hands to drop in the dirt, suddenly he knew the truth. His Kizzy was gone. She would not return. He would never see his Kizzy again. His face contorting, Quinta flung his dust toward the cabin's roof, tears bursting from his eyes, snatching his heavy gourd up over his head, his mouth wide in a soundless scream. He hurled the gourd down with all his strength, and it shattered against the packed earth floor. His 662 pebbles representing each month of his 55 rains flying out, ricocheting wildly in all directions. Chapter 84. Weak and dazed, Kizzy lay in the darkness on some burlap sacks in the cabin where she had been pushed when the mule cart arrived shortly after dusk. She wondered vaguely what time it was. It seemed that night had gone on forever. She began tossing and twisting, trying to force herself to think of something, anything that didn't terrify her. Finally, for the 100th time, she tried to concentrate on figuring out how to get up north, where she had heard so often that black people could find freedom if they escaped. If she went the wrong way, she might wind up deep south, where people said masses and overseers were even worse than Massa Waller. Which was north? She didn't know. I'm going to escape anyway, she swore bitterly. It was as if a pin pricked her spine when she heard the first creaking of the cabin's door. Springing upright and backward in the dark, she saw the figure entering furtively, with a cupped hand shielding a candle's flame. Above it she recognized the face of the white man who had purchased her, and she saw that his other hand was holding up a short-handled whip, cocked ready for use. But it was the glazed leer on the white man's face that froze her where she stood. "Rather not have to hurt you none," he said, the smell of his liquored breath nearly suffocating her. She sensed his intent. He wanted to do with her what Pappy did with Mammy when she heard strange sounds from their curtained-off room after they thought she was asleep. He wanted to do what Noah had urged her to do when they had gone walking down along the fence row, and which she almost had given into, several times, especially the night before he had left, but he had frightened her too much when he exclaimed hoarsely, "I wants you with my baby." She thought that this white man must be insane to think that she was going to permit him to do that with her. "Ain't got no time to play with you now." The white man's words were slurred. Kizzy's eyes were judging how to bolt past him to flee into the night, but he seemed to read that impulse, moving a little bit sideways, not taking his gaze off her as he leaned over and tilted the candle to drain its melted wax onto the seat of the cabin's single broken chair. Then the small flame flickered upright, inching slowly backward. Kizzy felt her shoulders brushing the cabin's wall. "Ain't you got sense enough to know I'm your new massa?" He watched her, grimacing some kind of a smile. "You a fair-looking wench. Might even set you free if I like you enough." When he sprang, seizing Kizzy, she wrenched loose, shrieking as with an angry curse he brought the whip cracking down across the back of her neck. "I'll take the hide off you." Lunging like a wild woman, Kizzy clawed at his contorted face, but slowly he forced her roughly to the floor. Pushing back upward, she was shoved down again. Then the man was on his knees beside her, one of his hands choking back her screams. "Please, massa, please." The other stuffing dirty burlap sacking into her mouth until she gagged. As she flailed, her arms in agony, and arched her back to shake him off, he banged her head against the floor again, then began slapping her, more and more excitedly, until Kizzy felt her dress being snatched upward, her undergarments being ripped. Frantically thrashing, the sack in her mouth muffling her cries, she felt his hands fumbling upward between her thighs, fingering her private parts, squeezing and spreading them. Striking her another numbing blow, the man jerked down his suspenders, made motions at his trousers front. Then came the searing pain as he forced his way into her, and Kizzy's senses seemed to explode. On and on it went, until finally she lost consciousness. In the early dawn, Kizzy blinked her eyes open. She was engulfed in shame to find a young black woman bending over her and sponging her private parts gently with a rag and warm soapy water. When Kizzy's nose told her that she had also soiled herself, she shut her eyes in embarrassment, soon feeling the woman cleaning her there as well. When Kizzy slitted her eyes open again, she saw that the woman's face seemed as expressionless as if she were washing clothes, as if she were but another of the many tasks she had been called upon to perform in her life. Finally laying a clean towel over Kizzy's loins, she glanced up at Kizzy's face. "Reckon you ain't feel like talking none now," the woman said quietly, gathering up the dirty rags in her water pail, preparing to leave. Clutching these things in the crook of one arm, she began again, and used her free hand to draw up a burlap sack to cover most of Kizzy's body. "'Fore long, I bring you something to eat," she said, and went on out of the cabin door. Kizzy lay there feeling as if she were suspended in mid-air. She tried to deny to herself that the unspeakable, unthinkable thing had really happened, but the lancing pains of her torn privates reminded her that it had. She felt a deep uncleanness, a disgrace that could never be erased. She tried shifting her position, but the pain seemed to spread. Holding her body still, she clutched the sack tightly about her, as if somehow to cocoon herself against any more outrage, but the pains grew worse. Kizzy's mind raced back across the past 4 days and nights. She could still see her parents' terrified faces, still hear their helpless cries as she was rushed away. She could still feel herself struggling to escape from the white trader whom the Spotsylvania County Sheriff had turned her over to. She had nearly slipped free after pleading that she had to relieve herself. Finally they had reached some small town where, after long, bitterly angry haggling, the trader at last had sold her to this new massa, who had awaited the nightfall to violate her. Mammy, Pappy, if only screaming for them could reach them, but they didn't even know where she was, and who knows what might have happened to them. She knew that Massa Waller would never sell anyone he owned less than day breaks his rules, but in trying to stop the Massa from selling her, they must have broken a dozen of those rules. And Noah, what of Noah? Somewhere beaten to death? Again it came back to Kizzy vividly. Noah demanding angrily that to prove her love, she must use her writing ability to forge a traveling pass for him to show if he should be seen, stopped, and questioned by patrollers or any other suspicious whites. She remembered the grim determination etched on his face as he pledged to her that once he got up north with just a little money saved from a job he would quickly find, "Gonna steal back here and slip you north, too, for the rest our days together." She sobbed anew. She knew she would never see him again, or her parents, unless... Her thoughts leaped with a sudden hope. Missy Ann had sworn since girlhood that when she married some handsome rich young massa, Kizzy alone must be her personal maid, later to care for the house full of children. Was it possible that when she found out Kizzy was gone, she had gone screaming, ranting, pleading to Massa Waller? Missy Ann could sway him more than anyone else on earth. Could the massa have sent out some men searching for the slave dealer, to learn where he had sold her, to buy her back? But soon now, a new freshet of grief poured from Kizzy. She realized that the sheriff knew exactly who the slave dealer was. They would certainly have traced her by now. She felt even more desperately lost, even more totally abandoned. Later, when she had no more tears left to shed, she lay imploring God to destroy her, if he felt she deserved all this just because she loved Noah. Feeling some slickness seeping between her upper legs, Kizzy knew that she was continuing to bleed, but the pain had subsided to a throbbing. When the cabin's door came creaking open again, Kizzy had sprung up and was rearing backward against the wall before she realized that it was the woman. She was carrying a steaming small pot with a bowl and spoon, and Kizzy slumped back down onto the dirt floor as the woman put the pot on the table, and spooned some food into the bowl, which she placed down alongside Kizzy. Kizzy acted as if she saw neither the food nor the woman, who squatted beside her and began talking as matter-of-factly as if they had known each other for years. "I's the big house cook. My name Melizzy. What's your'n?" Finally, Kizzy felt stupid not to answer. "It Kizzy, Miss Melizzy." The woman made an approving grunt. "You sounds well raised." She glanced at the untouched stew in the bowl. "I reckon you know you let victuals get cold. They don't do you no good." Miss Melizzy sounded almost like Sister Mandy or Aunt Suki. Hesitantly picking up the spoon, Kizzy tasted the stew, then began to eat some of it slowly. "How old you is?" asked Miss Melizzy. "I's 16, ma'am." "Massa bound for hell just shows he born," exclaimed Miss Melizzy, half under her breath. Looking at Kizzy, she said, "Just well's to tell you Massa one of dem what loves women's, 'specially young'uns like you. He used to mess with me. I ain't but round 9 years older'n you, but he quit after he brung Missy here and made me de cook, workin' right there in de house where she is, thanks be to God." Miss Melizzy grimaced. "'Spec you gonna be seein' him in here regular." Seeing Kizzy's hand fly to her mouth, Miss Melizzy said, "Honey, you just wells realize you a woman. De kind of white man massa is, you either gives in or he gonna make you wish you had, one way or another. And let me tell you, dis massa a mean thing if you cross him. Fact, ain't never knowed nobody get mad the way he do. Everything can be gone along just fine, then let just anything happen dat rile him." Miss Melizzy snapped her fingers. "Quick as dat, he can fly red hot and act like he done gone crazy." Kizzy's thoughts were racing. Once darkness fell, before he came again, she must escape. But it was as if Miss Melizzy read her mind. "Don't you even start thinking 'bout running nowhere, honey. He just have you hunted down with them blood dogs, and you in a worser mess. Just calm yourself. The next 5 days he ain't going to be here nohow. Him and his ol' chicken trainer already done left for one of them big chicken fights halfway 'cross the state." Miss Melizzy paused. "Massa don't care about nothin' much as them fightin' chickens of his'n." She went on talking non-stop about how the massa, who had grown to adulthood as a po-cracker, bought a 25-cent raffle ticket that won him a good fighting rooster, which got him started on the road to becoming one of the area's more successful gamecock owners. Kizzy finally interrupted. "Don't he sleep with his missus?" "Sho he do," said Miss Melizzy. "He just love women's. You won't never see much of her 'cause she's scared to death of him, and she keep real quiet and stay close. She whole lot younger'n he is. She was just 14, same kind of po-cracker he was, when he married her and brung her here. But she done found out he don't care much for her as he do his chickens." As Miss Melizzy continued talking about the massa, his wife, and his chickens, Kizzy's thoughts drifted away once again to thoughts of escape. "Gal, is you payin' me 'tention?" "Yes'm," she replied quickly. Miss Melizzy's frown eased. "Well, I specs you better, since I's 'quaintin' you with where you is." Briefly, she studied Kizzy. "Where you from, anyhow?" Kizzy said from Spotsylvania County, Virginia. "Ain't never heard of it. Anyhow, this here's Caswell County in North Carolina." Kizzy's expression showed that she had no idea where that was, though she had often heard of North Carolina, and she had the impression that it was somewhere near Virginia. "Looky here, does you even know Massa's name?" asked Miss Melizzy. Kizzy looked blank. "Him's Massa Tom Lee." She reflected a moment. "Reckon now dat make you Kizzy Lee." "My name Kizzy Waller," Kizzy exclaimed in protest. Then, with a flash, she remembered that all of this had happened to her at the hands of Massa Waller, whose name she bore, and she began weeping. "Don't take on so, honey," exclaimed Miss Melizzy. "You sho knows takes whoever's dey Massa's name. Names don't make no difference nohow, just something to call 'em." Kizzy said, "My pappy real name Kunta Kinte, he a African." "You don't say!" Miss Melizzy appeared taken aback. "I's heard my great-granddaddy was one of them Africans, too." My mammy say her mammy told her he was blacker'n tar, with scars zigzagging down both cheeks, but my mammy never said his name. Miss Melissy paused. You know yo mammy too? Course I does. My mammy name Belle. She a big house cook like you is, and my pappy drive de massa's buggy. Least he did. You just come from bein' wid yo mammy and pappy both? Miss Melissy couldn't believe it. Lord, ain't many us gets to know both our folks, fo somebody gets sole away. Sensing that Miss Melissy was preparing to leave, suddenly dreading being left alone again, Kizzy sought a way to extend the conversation. You talks a whole lot like my mammy, she offered. Miss Melissy seemed startled, then very pleased. I 'spects she a good Christian woman like I is. Hesitantly, Kizzy asked something that had crossed her mind. What kind of work they gonna have me doing here, Miss Melissy? Miss Melissy seemed astounded at the question. What you gonna do? She demanded. Massa ain't told you how many here? Kizzy shook her head. Honey child, you makin' 'zactly 5, and that's countin' Mingo, the ol' that live down 'mongst the chickens, so it's me cookin', washin', and housekeepin', and Sister Sarah and Uncle Pompey workin' in the field, where you sho gonna go too, that you is. Miss Melissy's brows lifted at the dismay on Kizzy's face. What work you done where you was? Cleanin' in the big house and helpin' my mammy in the kitchen, Kizzy answered in a faltering voice. Figured something like that when I hear them soft hands of yourn. Well, you sure better get ready for some calluses and corn soon's massa get back. Miss Melissy then seemed to feel that she should soften a bit. Po thing, listen here to me. You been used to one dem rich massa's places, but this here one dem po crackers what scrabbled and scraped till he got holt a little land and built a house that ain't nothing but a big front to make him look better off than they is. Plenty crackers like that round here. They got a sayin', farm 100 acres would foe. Well, he too tight to buy even that many, 'cause he ain't got but 80-some acres, and farmin' just enough that day to lay claim to bein' a massa. His big thing is his 100-and-some fighting chickens that Mingo helpin' him raise and train to bet on in fights. Only thing Massa spend any money on is them chickens. He always swearin' to Missy one day them chickens gonna see him rich. He get drunk and tell her one of these days he gonna build her a house so big it have 6 columns cross the front, and be 2 stories tall, and even finer in the houses of these real rich masses hereabouts what snubs him so bad, like they still the po crackers they started out. Fact, Massa claim he's savin' up for the day he build that fine house. Huh. Might for all I know. I know he too tight to even have a stable boy, let alone to drive in places like near about all Massa's has. He hitch up his own buggy and wagon both, saddle his own hoss, and he drive hisself. Honey, the only reason I ain't out in the field is Missus can't hardly cook water, and he love to eat. 'Sides that, he likes the looks of having a house servant for when they guests come. When he get to drinking out somewhere, he love viting in guests for dinner, trying to put on the dog, and specially if he been winning pretty good, betting on his roosters at them cockfights. But anyhow, he finally had to see wasn't no way just Uncle Pompey and Sister Sarah could farm much as he liked to plant, and he had to get somebody else. That's how come he bought you. Miss Melissy paused. You know how much you cost? Kizzy said weakly. No'm. Well, I reckon $600 to $700, considering the prices I's heard him say costin' nowadays. And you bein' strong and young, looking like a good breeder too. That'll bring him free. With Kizzy again speechless, Miss Melissy moved closer to the door and stopped. Fact, I wouldn't have been surprised if Massa stuck you in with one of them stud. Some rich Masses keeps on they places and hires out, but it looked like to me he figuring on breeding you hisself.